in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. It's something that is seen a lot, I think, this VO2 max. What is VO2 max? Like those sort of things. But I think it gets a little bit over conflated sometimes, where people are like, oh, VO2 max, if I improve my VO2 max, that's going to make me a better athlete. And that's not always the case. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Aaron Geiser, where we're going to talk about our favorite VO2 Max protocols and how to make aerobic development fun. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here. And we always bring up fascinating topics, and I think we got another one today.
Certainly. And especially, I was telling you that I really appreciate our conversations because I'm slowly getting into more aerobic development, more VO2 max development within my cycling, sort of training. And it's always fun to be able to bounce ideas off of you. So here's one. So today, or I had been noticing during my easy workouts, I'm at about 2,000 feet above sea level here in Bend. It isn't very high, but I've always had issues with altitude in a sense. So the other day I was like, I found my little pulse oximeter, and I was like, I wonder what my pulse ox is, during my workouts and stuff. So at rest, it was 97%, 97, 98, which is generally pretty normal, right? And then I was doing just a zone 2 ride. So this is like stuff that like I've tested over and over, and it's like really easy, really maintainable for me. When I first put it on, and it like, it took a second to even out, it was at like 92 or 93. And again, this is at a heart rate of 128 beats per minute, all stuff that's super maintainable. So I'm like, oh my God, like, how anemic am I? Like, and other stuff like that. So it's like, it's like get on PubMed, not PubMed, but WebMD. It's like, oh, well, you're dying. I didn't actually do that, but I started to rack my brain. Yeah, I thought about it. I started to rack my brain thinking about, okay, well, what could actually be happening here? And so I was like, okay, well, they're with a lot of endurance training, you might not have enough iron on board, or something along those lines, in order to carry enough oxygen. So then you might be pulling off too much. So I was like, okay, well, probably doesn't hurt to just take maybe an iron supplement here and there, obviously get it tested before and after, and just see if I'm in the optimal range, and if that goes up, what happens to my performance, what happens to how I'm feeling. So that was the first thing I did. But then the second thing I did, and I did this morning, because I was talking to Dr. Jacobs on another episode, and I was like explaining the same thing. And he was like, well, what about your breathing? Like, how is your breathing during your workouts? And it's something that I've never really thought about, because it's like, oh, breathing is breathing, right? Your body is going to breathe enough to get enough oxygen in, and you're going to breathe out enough to get CO2 out. I'm starting to change my tune on that, because I started today. So every day I do a step test in order to see how ready I am to actually train. And during the step test today, I was just making sure that I was breathing in more forcefully and breathing out more forcefully. Mm-hmm. And during the entire step test, I was able to maintain my arterial oxygen saturation at or above 95%. And along with that, my heart rate was lower. My SMO2 was a little bit higher. And, so all things in terms of like, endurance predictors or endurance physiology response was facing in the positive direction. So now I'm like, maybe I need to actually practice this, right? Practice forceful inhalation and exhalation. The only challenge is that I can definitely tell that is going to be challenging if I were to do it for like an hour or something along those lines. So what I'm asking you, or what I'm wondering about, is like, have you ever, worked with respiratory training, done sort of stuff like this? And do you have any, tips or tricks, to make it a little bit easier? Because it felt like I was actually like working pretty hard when I was breathing that hard.
And respiratory training, not a ton, because I have a whole lot of people that are 800 feet of elevation or sea level. So it doesn't necessarily come into play for a lot of athletes that I'm coaching at the moment, but you always kind of keep the research and reading in that case. And I'm, I'm glad that that was brought to your attention because it is, I mean, sometimes like there's a lot of good books out there about breathing, and often
Mm-hmm.
you have a lot of people that just say, yeah, breathing's breathing, you just, but due to my professional career with working with all types of individuals, but especially not just in the triathlon community, when I work with individuals from the physical therapy or like post therapy response I might get with some older individuals,
Mm-hmm.
and really based on what they had done as far as their career, sometimes that leads to either postural issues or breathing issues. And it's made me somewhat more um, exposed to that portion of it, just because I find a lot of individuals that like critical think quite a bit at a computer have worse breathing technique than individuals that are either moving, standing for longer periods of time, or just not forced to critically think or stare at something for long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
So this makes a heck of a lot of sense that's part of it, and especially it actually in your case could have been something that was a prerequisite to all the time that you put to your doctorate,
Mm.
and that just kind of led into this kind of current exposure to getting back into cycling and other forms of endurance training. I feel like it might have something to do with kind of what your current, I don't want to call it a weakness, but your current challenge is, obstacle.
Yeah. No, it certainly seems to be leaning that way. And like I said, I've always been pretty sensitive to altitude. So like, from that perspective, right? If we're going by like the definition of exercise induced hypoxemia, then I
Mm-hmm.
certainly have it, right? Like they say, if you're lower than an SaO2 of 94% at the end of a VO2 max test, then you're already doing it. And I'm at what, 55%, like or like 50% of VO2 max or something like that.
Yeah.
Because yeah, so it's just something that's really interesting to me, because and especially I think it's especially apparent with like running for me. Like it's really hard for me to like breathe in deeply. But with cycling, I'm like, oh yeah, like I can always output way more power, like things normally feel good. But I'm starting to come to the idea, the conclusion that maybe this is something that I do need to practice. And I don't think I even need to practice, like respiratory muscle training or like other things like that. I think I just need to practice on focused breathing,
Yeah.
especially like during that step test or that warm up every single day, and then hopefully that will start to strengthen things and get better over time.
Well, one thing that I would even recommend, kind of knowing you and how your days traditionally kind of unfold, is almost maybe getting into like a box breathing technique before you have this long focused amount of,
Mm,
whether you're cutting video or you have some calls lined up. I would almost make the recommendation to sit down, go through about a 5 to 10 minute process of box breathing. And in that, I just mean breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, and then repeat.
mm-hmm,
You can also move that up to 5 or 6, but 4 is the most kind of common practice to go with, and see if that translates over to some of these areas where you are really kind of stimulating from the mental aspect of things, and that hopefully will then translate into more portions of your day that are being controlled through positive breath.
mm-hmm. I mean, this might be a stretch, but I think it could be due to just like patterned, like you were saying, pattern breathing over time, where it's like I'm I'm generally a high stress individual. So, I think that will probably shift the type of breathing that you're doing. Even if I am breathing
Absolutely.
through my nose or something, maybe I'm taking shallower breaths and I'm just not taking advantage of the fact that I have a larger lung capacity. And then that translates over to when I'm exercising and not thinking about it, shallower breathing, which would then, potentially reduce, my ability to onboard or load more oxygen onto the red blood cells and keep arterial saturation high.
And I guess the more we talk about this we before we started recording, like both of us talked about how sometimes I call it when my brain is a rat on acid is when I when I like term it as, but when I can't keep with
Yeah.
one thought. And I feel like sometimes that probably is when I'm out of my breath sink and I'm
Mm.
not pulling in enough oxygen, which means that I'm having a harder time like focusing on smaller tasks or points where I really need to kind of stimulate my brain. I'm holding my breath, which is actually countering that creativity, and then you end up just jumping from one topic to the next, and next thing you know, 15 minutes down the road you're like, what the hell did I just accomplish in that
I
time?
was
And it
gonna
was
say
nothing.
4 hours down the
Yeah,
road, and you're just like, well, I didn't get anything done, but I did make a cart of disc golf discs that I'm gonna buy. That's where my brain's at, like right before we jumped on this. So I've just been
I
like,
just spent $700 on Amazon.
yeah, no, I know. Yeah, you just like get out of this like fugue state and you're just like, oh my gosh, why did I just buy that new bike, that new bike seat, right?
I just bought 7 pairs of running shoes. How am I going to tell my wife?
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, that's too funny. Yeah, I want like breathing is really fascinating. And there's been, if you would have asked me during my PhD and stuff, I mean, I always like to think that I'm a little bit more open-minded, but whenever we're in exercise physiology, nobody talks about adaptations to the respiratory system or how breathing patterns affects your performance and other things like that. And I think it's really short-sighted because we as researchers, it's like, oh, well, breathing, it doesn't really adapt because, it's hard. You can't take like a lung sample
Right.
and analyze, like how many capillaries have been produced. And I think that what that's come down to is like, people are just like, well, it's most likely, like your cardiorespiratory or your cardiovascular system is actually what's limiting your VO2 max, for example. And yeah, that's probably true for most people in most cases, but I've also talked to a lot of other coaches who have developed ways of monitoring or measuring, pulmonary function, especially during like exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And one guy I was talking to said that 70% of the athletes that he's ever tested had some level of inappropriate breathing patterns or respiratory limitation, which, I mean, if you think about it, right, we all think about breathing as just breathing and no one
Right.
ever teaches us how to do it. It's the same thing with running. Like, there are some people who just naturally have like a really nice gait, and then there's a lot of people who have never like been kind of taught how to run appropriately, and it's like everything is just weird and wacky and kind of all
Yeah.
over the place. So I think the moral of the story is I'm going to keep trying, to do this breathing sort of stuff, and maybe interrupt the patterns of daily breathing, with maybe that box breathing and other things like that, just to start to see, is it making a difference? Because um if that's my biggest limiting factor is my ability to breathe, and then I can bring that up, then that would be great. More performance for me.
Have you, and you've been now kind of taking that ramp test in the morning for, I want to say, almost 3 weeks now.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you like, has there been any numbers up until that point where that, like SMO number, SMO2 numbers or anything else, has that moved at all in that time, minus the harder, like the days after a harder session? Or
Hmm.
have you recognized any kind of development on the numbers just moving in general to getting into training at a little bit of an altitude and training consistently?
Well, so at this point, I'm already, I would say, like I've been trained for a while. Like I've been
Mm-hmm.
following my training plan for, I don't know, way more than 3 weeks.
Right.
So detecting any changes to like fitness are going to be, kind of slow and few and far between, I would say. The biggest things that I have found are, number one, it's not even like if I do like and this is a good transition potentially, but if I do a hard VO2 max workout like on the bike, the next day, SMO2 and heart rate, pretty much the same thing. Like
Right.
I'm really good at actually recovering, and I might not be going hard enough, but at the same time, like I'm putting out pretty good power for that compared to what my max power would be, and feel like I'm getting a good stimulus and everything. So I'm recovering pretty well. But the biggest thing that actually makes SMO2 and heart rate change the day afterwards is I'll do a run on Wednesday afternoons, and it's downhill for a mile, uphill for a mile, and I'll do that for about 40 to 60 minutes, depending on how much time I have and how good I'm feeling. And the last 2 weeks, so I've done it for about 3 weeks. The last 2 weeks, it's significantly lower on the day following that, so the Thursday.
Interesting.
Um, but then
So,
today the biggest thing, like I changed my breathing patterns, and it was the highest I've ever seen it, like in terms of like the performance stuff that I've been
and that
talking
was
about.
going to be the next point that I was going to make is
Mm-hmm.
because you kind of asked early on what would your process be to kind of work on this.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same process that I would take if I was retraining gait. Would be
Mm.
let's take almost like these smaller snippets of 5 8 minutes and designated focus to the breathing habits, then pull it off for another 5 or 8 minutes and not focus on it.
Mm-hmm.
Come back another 5 minutes. So you're almost kind of like that. We have heard these and seen research on kind of the human brain is open for learning for these like 15-minute segments, and it's almost because of like the way we've been conditioned to watch TV and such.
Mm-hmm.
And so breaking it down into these smaller segments, I feel, so you can focus on it for that length of time, become
Mm-hmm.
proficient at it, then go away from that focus, allowing yourself to kind of uh, either utilize some of the skill that you just developed, but then also just reset the brain to come back to the focus time and then refocus yourself to it. So in both cases on the run and the bike, what I would do is just almost set a timer for segments of time. And
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't, I would more, I think this is going to be easier on runs across all types of exposure,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be high intensity tempo or just aerobic development. But on the bike, I think it would be a little bit easier because you are reaching at certain points just a little bit higher in those VO2 maxes. Not to put it on those days or do it in
Yeah.
your warm up of those days, but on your aerobic days, have this 5 minute or 8 minute clock that's just ticking off that you're focusing
Mm-hmm.
on that breath, and then see how that does kind of change the end landscape and see if that moves the needle for you as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's super good in terms of actionable items. Like I'll probably just start with 5 minutes, but especially, and this is kind of going into like how to make aerobic training a little bit more fun. If you're focusing on 5 minutes, of breathing effectively, and then you're relaxing for 5 minutes, then it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I got something to focus on for the next 5 minutes, and then I can transition to, okay, turn the brain off, watch some YouTube, whatever it is, and then get back to it.
Right.
So yeah, no, I think what I'll start to do is I'll start to try to do it during each step test, and every once in a while go off of it and just see like, oh, do I actually see those? Like it's a sizable difference.
Yeah.
It's not just like it, like, so I was very surprised, by it. But One is just, kind of like, anecdotal. We got to see if we actually get some patterns from it coming out. So, and the real interesting thing was, I think, so if I was looking at my SMO2 heart rate, power, those sort of things, there's ways to detect like your kind of zone 2 delineation point. And if I'm looking at that, I moved where my zone 2 was occurring from 180 watts to like upwards of 223 just by breathing better.
So
That's like
that's a little bit of a difference.
yeah, it's like kind of significant, right? So yeah, so I was like, holy crap, 40 watts. Like
That's a needle mover right there.
yeah. So it's exciting. It's obviously still in like, the preliminary phase of looking at things, but I do think that it could be one of the reasons why I've had, in my opinion, some assessments that go really, really well and look like my performance should be a lot higher than what it actually comes out to. So maybe this is the way to bridge that gap.
Well, and that right there leads to, I think, anytime anybody has a test or is thinking about a test, anxiety level goes up, their breathing patterns
Mm-hmm.
probably change. So
Mm-hmm.
that's also probably another reason why sometimes individuals don't test as well, is because the anxiety is kind of thrown off their normal breathing patterns, and then when they actually get into that, all things kind of go off the rails and go in a direction of wherever they're going to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see when I retest in a couple of weeks, how things have changed and if the breathing does affect it. So I'll keep people updated. This will probably be a while down the road, but what I do want to focus on today is VO2 max development, and just maximal power, maximal aerobic power in general, because for a lot of us being longer distance athletes, right, we're doing our really easy kind of light volume development, sort of zone 2, and then we're heard that we should hit the higher intensity stuff. Like, I think you and I are both doing it right now, and I get questioned time and time and time again, on Instagram, hey, what's the best way to develop VO2 max? So I think where we should start is just kind of like, what are all the different intervals that are out there, and then we can start to get into how to know which one to use, what point in the season maybe you should transition to it, and other things like that.
I think it's a great topic. I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with a brief introduction. So if you were to ask me what's the best way to develop VO2 max, I would say, well, typically coming from a running background, what we've seen is you do uh, kind of mile repeats is kind of that bread and butter. When we were in 5K development mode, it would be run probably 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, repeat that 3 to 5 times depending on where you're at in the season. And I think from the perspective of you know VO2 max development, like that is a very potent stimulus for improving VO2 max, improving your speed at VO2 max, and really, for a 5K, 2 mile, 1 mile, that's really what you're looking at trying to improve is that speed at VO2 max. Um, but what happened is like researchers were like, well, is that the optimal way, to kind of go about this? And so I can't remember the exact year, but there was, a group, and I believe it was Billet, Billat is the researcher who kind of started this, but 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, because the idea is that, well, maybe if we shorten those intervals, we can accumulate more time at the velocity that's going to dictate VO2 max. And I believe that they typically did this in runners. And what they showed is that compared to longer intervals, the shorter intervals did indeed allow for more accumulation of speed and physiological demand at or really close to VO2 max compared to those longer intervals. Then that was followed up with, well, okay, 30-30s. So this is where we get the kind of term 30-30. But then there were other groups that started to come in and say, well, maybe 1-to-1 rest ratio isn't the best for accumulating time at VO2 max. So it was introduced a 2-to-1 work rest ratio where you would have 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. And there's one study I was just reading. And if you're looking at, if you want to get into any of this like optimization of interval for VO2 max development, look up Ronestad, Ronestad, and he's got a bunch of stuff looking at this. But what he did is he said, okay, well, if our goal is to accumulate as much time as possible at VO2 max, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put people through a VO2 max test, and then we're going to this just sounds like a brutal research participation. But after the VO2 max test, we're going to have you do a warm up, and then you're going to ride as hard as or as long as you can at the power output that was achieved during your VO2 max test. So if that was 400 watts, the erg would be on 400 watts, and you would ride until you couldn't go anymore. And then what he did is he said, okay, well, we're going to do 30 seconds at that power output, and then 15 seconds rest. And we're going to compare that to groups that do 50% of the time that they could maintain at, their VO2 max, and then 80% of the time, so longer. So shorter, medium, long intervals. And what they showed, and this shouldn't be surprising, is that 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off was the best way of accumulating time at VO2 max. But now we have, tons and tons of variation of this, right? You have 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, 40 seconds on, 20 seconds off. And you still have your traditional VO2 max intervals as well. So, Aaron, what I would like to talk about or have you kind of touch on is, it's like, how do you use the different interval lengths? How do you determine what's appropriate for an athlete? What sort of decision making goes on there? Because you can also change how hard you're working during your rest intervals as well.
Right.
And during these 30-15s, they were working out like 50% of their VO2 max. So it was like still pretty high. It wasn't much of a rest. So I'll let you take it away.
So I've gone through the educational process of science and application of high intensity interval training. And it kind of covered a lot of what you just talked about, the different types, the systems that we're trying to hit: oxidative, anaerobic, and neuromuscular. And to answer the question that you just presented, it's really, there's so many different ways we're going to respond to that question with the right application and right prescription of that. But it still all starts at the foundation with the athlete. If the athlete can hold 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, but has trouble with the 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, you need to go in there and analyze what is the issue there. Like, is it not enough time for them to recover? So should we spend more time in 30-30, allowing them to still hit that quality high intensity, get them to recover, and then hit that high intensity again? Or do we start to use that as their primary form of the week, then give them a secondary workout that is 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, but much, much shorter? So the set period is maybe 5 or 6 reps compared to on the other, where we would give 11 or 12 and repeat that 2 or 3 times, maybe even 4 times. So would we come back and do a 5 or 6 repetition, 3 or 4 set model of the 30-15s to get them that exposure, still improve the anaerobic work capacity development to improve and get ready for that outburst again? That initial question is going to depend on what the athlete is at, where they're at, and how they are responding. Then as we start to, another athlete might be gold on the 30-15, 40-20s, Then what we're going to try to start to expose them to is 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or 1 minute on, 30 seconds off,
Mm-hmm.
and then start to then transition them to what is considered VO2 long in that case. Those 30-second efforts, 40-second efforts, up to a minute efforts, we typically place and classify in that 30 or VO2 max short segment. And then as we start to get above 90 seconds to 2 minutes and above, that's when we start to look at that as VO2 long. So
Mm-hmm.
really, it's I often, when I take an individual, when we're in the off season, I like to expose the short VO2 max efforts just to start to get that higher intensity exposure. Then when I
Mm-hmm.
actually take them through a true like higher intensity block, I'm throwing two workouts a week that are designated to that. And I wish I could answer this better for you, Phil, based on the way that you asked the question, but I have a couple of athletes where I'm in the 2 or 3 minute, maybe even up to 5 minute
Mm-hmm.
VO2 max long, where I'm only repeating that five, maybe three times. But then I'm having another one that's a little bit shorter, and it's a variety of the 30-15 and 40-20, where in other instances, I'm then giving an athlete because they can't hold that 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes at that output. We're doing just solely 30 seconds. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
one of them's 30-30, the other one's 30-15. And then with the goal over time is to try to start to expand them to the 30-15 and 40-20, and then start to extend that out. So it really, for the audience that's asking this question, it's just like many of the responses that we have. It's not a one size fits all model. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to be able to check the boxes of one to kind of go to the next one. So I almost look at it as there's a prerequisite to this style of training. You got to check off that first box before you start going to the second and third.
Yeah.
Because if you start at the second and third, one, from the mental standpoint, it's going to drag you down. Two, it's also going to elevate the overall stress load. And then how is that negatively affecting the rest of your training through the rest of that week and then the rest of
Mm-hmm.
that block?
Yeah, no, I said like a good coach, I would say. It's like everything has to be individualized, right? And it's like, okay, well, if you're really thinking about, VO2 max work and other things like that, I think the best place to start is the 30-30s, right? You run the lowest risk of, accumulating too much fatigue. You'll know very quickly if you overshot the power output that you're trying to uh aim for. And you also know, like, there's a lot less harm accidentally underestimating what you can do. So being like, so for example, the first time I did the 30-30s, I do sets of 8 minutes. So I'm accumulating 4 minutes of VO2 max work. And I started at like 330 watts for the first set, 3 minutes rest, 360 watts for the second set, 3 minutes rest, and then 390 watts for the fourth or for the third set. And I felt pretty good. The 390 was a lot, and it was tiring, but it wasn't so much where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to work out the next day. Um, and then I bumped it up the following week that I did it. I bumped it up to 360, 390, 420. So, and so then what you can do is you can start to play with, okay, well, maybe my rest period or my rest is a little bit too low. So if I find like a nice working level, say 360 to 390 is my working level for those 30 seconds, then I can start to bump up the rest, or make the rest harder in a sense. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And again, I think people get a little bit too concerned with like what is actually optimal, because if you look at the research, then like the optimal way to do it is 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off at 50, with the rest period being 50% of your VO2 max, and then you just go until you fail. Right? You just keep repeating those until you accumulate as much volume as you possibly can, and then then there you go. But the problem with that is that yes, from a research perspective, that's probably optimal. But if you tried to repeat that 2-3 times in a week, which is again generally what people do to, or what researchers do to try to elicit the most response in a certain variable like VO2 max, you're going to run the risk of accumulating too much fatigue, burning yourself out, and then just not even enjoying it. So another benefit of starting with 30-30s is that, and I was talking to somebody on Instagram about this, is like 30-30s are actually kind of fun because you get to hammer it for 30 seconds, and then it's like 30 seconds rest. That's like almost an eternity in terms of high intensity interval rest. But when you start to get to the 15s, or if you do 40-20, it's like, oh boy, like that's not very much rest, or you start to raise it up. So just also know that that VO2 max work is also supposed to be hard. If you want to get high intensity adaptations, you have to be working at high intensity, and you have to do it for a little bit of an extended period of time.
And I
So
think this is where most people miss out actually on expanding and growing their VO2 capabilities and capacity. And it's either the like anterior governor system or little mental barrier that is preventing you from pushing to that point. And it's uncomfortable. It
mhm,
has to be uncomfortable by definition to elicit the response that we want to get.
mhm,
So it's being honest with yourself of this hits that 8.5 to 9 RPE. This, and I think you and I've talked about, I've really gone away from the traditional FTP model because I
mhm,
just do not see the translation between aerobic, VO2 max, threshold, tempo. I just don't think that it actually, for most athletes, they're either more type 2, type 1, and that's going to affect one of
mhm,
those two, and it's going to throw off most everything. So even if you do the inside or in sync, if you do the 1 minute reps, if you do the 20 minute, or you do the hour long FTP test, I still think that there are disadvantages for certain styles of training that number is not going to translate over. And I
yeah,
feel like, go
it's
ahead.
only getting an estimate. Sorry, it's only getting an estimate of that second threshold. And for VO2 max work, you're not working at second threshold. You're
Right.
working well above that. So you need to do something where, like, if you're trying to estimate where like this percentage is going to be, an ideal way of doing this would just be do a 3-minute step test. You don't even have, you can just record power and heart rate and just see what you get up to. Whatever you get up to, if it's you start at, I like to start at 60 to 100 watts. So start at 100 watts, go up 20 watts every 3 minutes until you can't go anymore, and then use that as your first estimate. If you do shorter intervals, then you'll obviously get a higher power output. But again, it's just an estimate. So use that estimate, do the workout once. If it felt too easy, if it wasn't that, would you say 8.5 to 9.5 in
Yeah.
terms of RPE, then you got to bump it up.
And that's a good formula. And also, I would almost make the recommendation within the workout itself
Mm-hmm.
of if you're not hitting that 8.5 or 9 in the middle of that workout, then let's not waste the rest of that workout and then
Mm-hmm.
wait for the next time. So go ahead and start to up it in that next one or in that next effort. But
Mm-hmm.
I I've really taken more of a strategic approach where, especially with my athletes, I do have that range. And we're going to start with the numbers here, but based on how you feel, we might need to adjust that bias in that particular workout up or down on that particular day to get and the response that we're looking for. But
Mm-hmm.
as far as the effort, I mean, you got to get away from it. It's supposed to be hard. You want it to be hard, and make it hard.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't
And
make it hard, then you're missing the boat, and it doesn't matter how long you're holding it or what you're holding. If you're not making it hard, you're not going to elicit the response that you're trying to get.
yeah, you're not going to elicit the optimal amount of response, right? And that's
Right.
and then the follow-up to that is, it might be appropriate in the beginning to just do one VO2 max workout a week, maybe
Yeah.
two, depending on how you're recovering. If you're a triathlete, like triathlon training always kind of trips me up a little bit because it's like you're training for three sports simultaneously. And, so it's like, okay, well, if I do two or three VO2 max workouts for bike, then it's like, okay, well, you're running and you're cycling. You can't be doing, two or three VO2 max workouts.
Biking
But
you can, but I
yeah,
mean,
no,
biking and swimming, I should say you can, but
yeah, yeah.
typically at that stress load, it does make it much, much more difficult for the run.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing I've been finding is that in biking, I think you can get away with more intensity more often because it's that concentric contraction. As long as you're fueling on the bike, and fueling around your training and everything, it's generally easier to recover compared to running, for example. But what I was going to say was um, the you want to make your VO2 max workouts hard, but then that requires you to go easier on your off days. That's another caveat that I think people fail to remember is if you're really busting ass during these VO2 max workouts, then you should be taking it really, really easy. Like you say, laughably easy, on your zone two, sort of work. You can still build volume by being on the bike a little bit longer, but it has to be easy because your goal then, especially in the off season, right, when we're following maybe a little bit more of a polarized model, is to easy accumulate a little bit of volume, get ready for those higher intensity workouts, and then crush those high intensity workouts.
Yeah.
Get the most out of them.
And it's like we've said that before.
I know. If I like I don't mind sounding like a broken record because I think more people need to hear this sort of stuff, but it's also, it's also repetition, right? It's the same thing. We're practicing how we deliver it so that hopefully then people can like take something away from it. And maybe it makes a little bit more sense now when you're saying, okay, well, if your goal is to get your high intensity stuff better, then you have to stress the system to improve. Your body is only going to lay more adaptations if you are pushing it to do so. Your body doesn't just like carry extra. It's like I'm just gonna adapt to the minimal amount so that I can reestablish homeostasis.
Well, and this again, I still think as we continue to talk on so many topics, it just comes back to what's the context. What are
Mm-hmm.
like when these athletes are asking you, how do I improve my VO2 max? Often the response is, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Is it
Mm-hmm.
only to increase your VO2 max, or are there other areas that you're also trying to improve in that? And that is also going to direct what that answer is going to be right for that individual. Is if they're solely looking to expand their VO2 max, then as we've talked about multiple times, you can expose yourself that 2 times a week if your body
Mm-hmm.
can cope with it. But if you're also looking at if you want to gain strength on the bike, if you want to improve your aerobic function on the bike, if you want to do these other things, then that also answers part of the question of how we're going to, like, we need to provide you with a lot of different stimulus rather than just focusing on one stimulus in this case. So
Mm-hmm.
it again kind of comes back to what is that athlete looking for, and providing us with more context to provide the content to get them
Mm-hmm.
from point A to point B. Because without taking that other layer, we could give them the most optimal answer of the us for reading that question and reading it the way that our
Mm-hmm.
brains function and then answering it in that format, but it could completely open up a door to that athlete to not hit certain things that they're trying to be exposed to and evolve towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people, it's prevalent, everywhere, right? Oh, VO2 max, the higher the VO2 max you have, the lower risk of cardiovascular disease and other things like that. So from a health and wellness perspective, it's really been pushed, which is great. I really appreciate, that being talked about. But and then Garmin, right? Garmin will tell you what your VO2 max is based on your performances and your watch based times and other things like that. So it's something that is seen a lot, I think, this VO2 max. What is VO2 max? Those sort of things. But I think it gets a little bit over conflated sometimes, where people are like, oh, VO2 max, if I improve my VO2 max, that's going to make me a better athlete. And that's not always the case. And you also have to remind yourself, if for example, you're the type of person who's been doing VO2 max work, 2-3 times a week for the last 6 months, and your VO2 max isn't getting any better, well, maybe it's not the appropriate time to focus on VO2 max work. Maybe your second threshold is super low comparatively now. So maybe you need to work on your second threshold, get that up a little bit until it's butting up kind of closer to your VO2 max. And then at that point, maybe you've placed more structures and more things to be able to get that VO2 max even higher the next time you target it. So you can't just get stuck in, oh, I only do VO2 max training, right? You need to focus on all the different aspects of your fitness, and you have to ask yourself, well, what's the point of improving my VO2 max right now? And I think, the way that we talk about it is more long course, sort of efforts, 1 hour, 2 hours, 2 hours to 8 hours, sort of deal. And we've talked about this on the show a lot, is, again, you have to train. Well, you go from general to specific, and you have to train to the threshold that is going to be most meaningful towards your goal race. So an 8-hour Ironman, you're going to be a lot closer to your first threshold than your second threshold. During a 2-hour, say marathon, if you're an elite level athlete, you're probably going to be pretty close to that second threshold. So you probably got to train a little bit right there. If you're a sprinter, not a sprinter, but a 1,600 meter runner, a 3,200 meter runner, a 5K runner, then VO2 max is going to be that threshold, right? So you have to take that into context. And it is hard, right, to answer somebody's question that's like, oh, well, what's the best VO2 max protocol? Just on Instagram in a minute, right? When I have a minute to answer in a story. Yeah. It's so just know, for everybody who's out there, we need more context. Why do you think improving VO2 max is going to be the number one thing that's going to drive that performance further? And, and then at the end of the day, if you've done, again, VO2 max work for the last 6 months, you probably stand to make more benefit from something you're not doing than something you're continuing to do.
And spoken from the long distance triathlon coach, we don't get me wrong, VO2 max can be a predictive index that we utilize, but often in endurance events of that long, we're going to actually want to taper that VO2 max down in the improvement of kind of that tempo, or kind of that in between LT1, LT2 level that we're consistently racing upon. That naturally is just going to have you decrease that VO2 max through that course of training as well. So again, providing in the question, providing what type of athlete that you are, like what is your either next race, or what is your A race, what is your focus, will give us a little bit more context to make the right directioning answer that's going to move the needle best for you. Because yes, it is likely there's going to be some VO2 max that we're going to recommend, but to answer that question, it's going to be a little bit more specific from athlete A to athlete W. So we just need to get some of that classification to know, all right, well, here's the recommendation, rather than just saying, you know what, it's this. Because that's from a coaching perspective, if you have somebody that answers that question, I'd walk away.
Yeah,
Like
it's
without the context, I should say.
yeah, and it's one thing to try to make general answers. Like, I think it's still like you can still try, say, oh, well, if you're trying to improve your VO2 max, maybe 30/30s is a good place to start. I generally default to, oh, if you're trying to increase your VO2 max, typically what I've done in the past, and it's all caveats, is the 3 minutes on, or 3 to 5 minutes on, 3 to 5 minutes off by three to five times. And then, and I've had great discussions with coaches, on Instagram and stuff, where it's like, well, those 3 to 5 minutes, those are way too hard for our athletes. But I think people get a little bit caught up in like the really the minutia of, like what it is. It's like, okay, well, what are you trying to do? You're trying to improve someone's VO2 max because conceivably that's going to make them a better athlete. If they're able to uptake and utilize more oxygen, that probably means that they have better capillary density, better mitochondrial density and mitochondrial function, so on and so forth. We know that being able to reestablish oxygen homeostasis is really, really important for endurance performance. So like, so if we take it back to saying, okay, well, we're trying to improve somebody's oxygen uptake and all of that, there's a lot of different ways you can improve somebody's oxygen uptake. And you have to also remember, when you start to talk about research, who is the study actually being done on? Because a lot of the studies that we talked about earlier are elite level cyclists. So those elite level cyclists have probably done 3 minutes on, 5 minutes, or 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, repeated, 3 to 5 times, quite a bit. So if that is the case, then they might stand to adapt better to 30/15s, where they're just trying to accumulate as much time at VO2 max because they haven't done it before. Because that is a slightly different stimulus. So we just have to, again, you have to keep things in mind of like, what is the research saying? And then, as a coach or an athlete, how could I implement this into myself? It's like kind of like a reverse like reverse pyramid, in a sense. Is like, you take the research and the meta-analyses and stuff like that, and you say, okay, well, what does it seem like the best way to improve X, Y, or Z, in this case VO2 max? Then you say, okay, well, what have coaches used in the past that have worked either on myself or other groups? And then how can I tweak that for the N of one that is myself, in order to get the most benefit out of it? And personally, one VO2 max workout a week for me is completely adequate for me to continue to get better at that VO2 max, recover enough to be able to mentally do it every single week, and improve my power output. And it's the 30/30s that I've just really been enjoying. And I'm going to tweak it eventually, probably 3-4 weeks down the road. But that's how I would go about it, is, start with what does the research say? What are the coaches doing? And then what actually fits you as an individual? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's the best way to get better as an individual, is to individually tailor your training to yourself.
Well, and that's a good lead into, like, with the percentages, like the generic target is 103% or above, right?
Yeah.
For
And
VO2 max stimulus.
Yeah, this is of the power that is reached during a VO2 max ramp test, right?
Right. And
But I'll also say that if you do like the 3-minute steps, right, you're going to have a much lower power output that you can accomplish than if you did a 1-minute step. So,
but and that's exactly where I was going, where part of that context is how long is the segment, like how long is your repetition? Because
right.
if it's 30 seconds compared to 5 minutes, that comment that you made about the coach is that, oh, my athletes can't hold that. Well, maybe change the output level to respond to the length of time you're asking that athlete to go. So don't look at a 30-second VO2 max interval the same way as a 5-minute, because one individual might be pumping out 420 watts at a 30-second on, 30-second off output. That's not likely going to be a 430 or 420 output for 5 minutes. They're probably
no.
and let's say that 420, let's say it for that particular athlete, it's at 120, 121% of
Mm-hmm.
that estimated threshold level. You're going to probably pull that down closer to 108, 109, and some athletes you might have closer to 105 if you're going to
Mm-hmm.
extend that repetition out to 5 minutes. So having the smarts to also adjust the output limits to the time limits is also going to be super important to that, because I mean, I'm not seeing a whole lot of athletes that go out, throw out a max effort at 30 seconds repetitively, and then come back and throw that same amount of output at 5 minutes, unless they've
Mm-hmm.
strategically built from 30 seconds to 40 seconds to a minute, 2 minutes, and gone up that way. But again, we're talking about a progression of months in that case,
Yeah.
not weeks. So another thing is just also pay attention to how long that segment of time for the repetition is going to dictate the output number and percentage that you're trying to put out. It's not, it's all apples aren't apples now. I mean,
Mm-mm.
you got your galas, you got your grandma or granny smiths. You got to change the output in that case.
Mm-hmm. No, I know. I 100% agree with that, because there is no way, at least right now, that I would be able to maintain 420 watts for, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe a single best effort, like type of deal. But I wouldn't be able to repeat that, 3 to 5 times, that we were talking about. So, and that 420 watts, if we're actually thinking about it, my max on like the last step test that I did was like 360, and I did 360 watts for 3 minutes. So I mean, that's significantly above that, that power output that I did get to. That's why I did start at 330 to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And now I start at 360, and then next week I'll probably start at 390, and then see how it goes. I haven't hit a point where I'm I'm more, it's the RPE for me has been probably, in the first set, 7.5 ish. Like it feels heavy, but it's not terrible. Then it's like
Mm-hmm.
8, and then it's like 8.5, with like maybe getting up into the 9 on like the last, like 30 seconds or 30 seconds. But I haven't gotten to a point where I'm like, oof, I failed that workout because I, like went too hard. So I'm still trying to calibrate and see where I'm at. And it's, again, we kind of harped on, it's like you got to go hard, but if you're going a little bit, it's okay to still be a little bit under that in terms of the estimation, because chances are you'll recover faster. You'll be able to come back, give it a shot earlier than what you would actually, if you had gone way too hard for it,
The
right?
coaching for success in that model is to still feel like you have one or two reps left in the bag before finishing that set anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
that is ideal. If you get to the last repetition and man, I couldn't give one of those if I wanted to. You probably in that scenario overreach slightly, because from the scientific side of this, we want to at least feel like we could give one or maybe two efforts of that time afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't, then that also is an indicator that maybe you're just pushing a little. You're getting to that 975, almost 10 in that case,
Mm-hmm.
and that might not be because what you just talked about, what that ends up doing is throwing off the recovery aspect and
Mm-hmm.
delaying that. So therefore, you're getting into the next activity that you have underwater, and then that could just continue to take you down, down, down in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's the reason why, like following up with like an easier workout, like zone 2, but like maybe laughably easy, like you're having fun time, you're breathing, you're talking, those sort of things is so important, for following up those high intensity efforts, because high intensity efforts also take a lot of mental focus, right? Especially, towards the end, it's like, okay, I gotta get the brain up. So I don't know if I think I told you this. I did a 1 hour FTP the other day. It was the first one I've done, and I don't even know how long. And talk about a mental effort, right? It is that is challenging to be like, okay, well, I think I can maintain this for the next 15 minutes, right? When you have like 30 minutes left, 15 minutes left, whatever it is. So just keep that in mind as well, is that, like maybe your mental gas tank is going to be a little bit lower than what your physical gas tank is saying. so you also have to just be aware of that. And I think, Aaron, if you're okay with it, I think we'll kind of stop here unless you have something else you wanted to add.
The one thing that I did want to add is this reminds me of, I want to say it was our discussion a couple of weeks ago to the block periodization, or what people have termed kind of the Norwegian model, but I call the block periodization model.
Mm-hmm.
It when people were asking the questions, how should I do it? When should I do it? Hopefully some of the topic of this conversation will have people start to think, okay, well, maybe that is not the right style of training for me, even if it's for a short period of time, like 3 or 4 weeks. So that's one important topic that I wanted. If you haven't listened to that conversation, I think it's the one between me and Phil, 2 before this, I want to say.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize that when we start to talk in terms of how hard these workouts are supposed to be, and you look at doing multiple sessions a day at these intensities, you should question yourself, am I ready for those? Like, am I at that point to even think about doing that, to do that? And I think that some of the things that we continue to say and repeat week after week would hopefully make our listeners make more intelligent decisions and not be like, okay, that's definitely, since that group is doing it, or you read another article about another group doing something else. Take these key pieces of information to make the decision for you. Is this the right style of training for me? And where am I at in my fitness journey?
Yeah, exactly. It's all, I think it took you a while to say this, but it's all context and then content. So, be realistic with yourself, be realistic with where you're at. And, if you can accomplish a heavy workload for one workout, why would you, then go add another hard workout that might be harder to, recover from? So, yeah, I think we'll leave you guys with that, and then I think next week what we'll talk about is the best way, or how to make aerobic development a little bit more fun. So I'll leave you with a teaser there. You can always find me and ask questions on Instagram at Critical02. You can find Aaron at Try a Geyser on Instagram. Reach out to him if you have any coaching questions, coaching inquiries, those sort of things. Don't forget that you can do the Zwift Saturday morning rides with Aaron, and actually Dr. Jacobs has a Zwift handle, so if you want to have a ride with him, go check out, I think it's R Jacobs, and then it's in parentheses 2,000 meters, so you can ride with him as well. Did you want to say something?
I was gonna say that's one way. You said it for me with the ride, but I was gonna say that is one way to make your aerobic endurance rides more interesting, is jump on that ride.
Heck yeah, there you go. Perfect plug right there. Yeah, so, and if you guys have any questions and you're on YouTube, comment down below. And this is the first time I've actually asked this, but if you guys wouldn't mind, if you're enjoying this podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple, because it really helps to push us a little bit up the charts, gets more eyes on what we're doing. So we would really, really appreciate it. If you have any, things we can change, we also appreciate you reaching out to us and letting us know what we can change. So with that, this is a super fun episode talking all about VO2 Max. Next week, we'll talk about making aerobic development fun. Get on that early morning Saturday Zwift ride, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.